The man who took the reins of her horse was not a man at all, but a piece of the mountain hewn into human form. Ilara watched him from beneath the brim of her bonnet, her hands knotted tight in the worn fabric of her lap. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with a stillness about him that seemed to absorb the crisp, thin air. His name was Silas Blackwood. She knew that much. She also knew he was a widower with 2 children, and that he lived so far from any settlement that the mail rider who brought her here had spoken of him as a legend, a ghost who traded furs for salt and iron twice a year. The mail rider, a grim man named Finch, dismounted and handed Silas a single, sealed envelope. Her letter. Her curse put to paper. This came with her, Finch said, his voice flat. He did not look at Ilara. No one had, not for the entire week-long journey. It was as if she were a parcel of bad luck they were all too eager to deliver. Silas took the letter. His hands were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. He did not open it. He simply tucked it into the inner pocket of his thick wool coat. His gaze, the color of slate under a winter sky, finally fell upon her. It was not unkind. It was not anything. It was merely observant, like a hawk assessing a field mouse from a great height. He was calculating her worth, her use. "The arrangement stands," Silas said. His voice was low and rough, like the sound of dry wood splitting. "You can get down." Ilara did. Her legs were stiff, her body aching from the ride. She stood on the hard-packed earth before his cabin, a structure of dark, massive logs that seemed to have grown from the ground itself. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a lonely gray plume against a vast, indifferent blue sky. Behind the cabin, the pines stood in a silent, jagged army, climbing the slopes of a mountain that scraped the clouds. This was her new home, or her new prison. She was not yet sure which. 2 small faces peered from a window, a boy and a girl, their eyes wide and hostile. They vanished as soon as she saw them. His children, the reason he needed a woman, the reason her family had found a place to discard her. Silas led her horse toward a lean-to barn. "There's stew on the hearth. The children will show you your room." He spoke without looking back, the words delivered as simple facts, not a welcome. She stepped inside the cabin. The air smelled of wood smoke, pine, and something savory. It was a single large room, dominated by a stone fireplace where a black pot bubbled. A long table and benches stood in the center. In the corner, 2 small beds. A ladder led to a loft. Everything was scrubbed clean, but stark, functional, devoid of any softness. It was a place of work, not comfort. A place of survival. The boy and girl stood near the hearth, barring her way. The boy, perhaps 8, held a whittling knife like a dagger. The girl, a year or 2 younger, clung to his sleeve, her small face a mask of defiance. "You're not our mother," the boy said, his voice a tremor of fury. Ilara looked at their fierce, grieving faces. She saw the ghost of the woman they had lost, a shadow that filled every corner of this silent house. She did not answer him. What could she say? He was right. She was a stranger, an interloper. She was the price he paid for his father's need. She simply unpinned her bonnet and set her small, battered satchel on the floor. She was tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had settled in her soul years ago. She would not fight them. She would simply exist, as quietly as she could, until this place decided what to do with her. That night, she lay in the small, curtained-off space Silas had called her room. It was little more than a cot behind a piece of sailcloth, cold and smelling of dust. She could hear the quiet sounds of the house settling. The whisper of the fire, the creak of the logs. She heard Silas pull a chair closer to the hearth. She heard the faint crinkle of paper. He was reading the letter. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She closed her eyes, reciting the words she knew were written there, the words of her own uncle, her guardian since her parents had passed in the fire. A bad seed, born under an ill star. The fever took her parents. The barn fire took our prize bull the week she came to us. My wife miscarried. Our well went dry. She brings misfortune wherever she treads. She is quiet and works hard, for what that is worth, but she is a curse. Take her if you must, but do not say you were not warned. She waited for the sound of his footsteps, for his rough voice telling her to leave, to cast her out into the unforgiving mountain night. But the silence only deepened. There was only the fire, and the wind moving through the pines like the breath of a sleeping giant. Silas stared at the letter, the firelight flickering across the neat, venomous script. He read it once. Then he read it again. He had known desperate men. He had known cruel men. But he had never encountered a cruelty so casual, so elegantly penned. A family casting off its own flesh and blood, with a label, a brand. Cursed, he looked at the list of tragedies. A fire, a fever, a miscarriage, a dry well. The ordinary, brutal hardships of life on the frontier, all laid at the feet of one quiet, plain-faced woman. He saw not a curse, but a litany of sorrows she had been forced to witness, and then to wear. They had made her a scapegoat for their own grief and failure. He thought of her face when she had arrived, the exhaustion in her eyes, the way she held herself perfectly still, as if expecting a blow. She had not pleaded, not wept, not offered a single word in her own defense. She had simply accepted. He folded the letter along its original creases. He thought of his own wife, Sarah, taken by a fever 3 winters past. He remembered the helplessness, the rage at a world that could be so arbitrary and cruel. Had he looked for someone to blame? He had blamed the winter, the distance from a doctor, God himself, but never a person. He looked toward the curtain that shielded Ilara's cot. He imagined her lying there, awake, waiting for his judgment. What must it be like, to carry the weight of so much blame, to be told, over and over, that your very presence brought ruin? He felt a slow, cold anger unfurl in his chest. An anger directed at the careful, cowardly man who had written this letter. An anger at a world that would allow such a thing. He did not move for a long time. The fire burned down to glowing embers. The children, Leo and Willa, slept soundly in their beds, their faces untroubled in the dim light. They were the reason for this. He could not trap and hunt and chop wood and raise 2 children alone. He could not teach Willa to sew or mend, could not soothe Leo's nightmares. He needed help. He had made a practical arrangement. He had traded supplies and a small sum of money for a housekeeper and a mother for his children. But the woman behind the curtain was not a housekeeper. She was a person who had been systematically broken down, and the proof of it lay in his hand. The next morning, Ilara woke to the smell of coffee. A sliver of pale light cut through a gap in the curtain. The cabin was quiet. She dressed quickly, her fingers cold and clumsy. She braced herself, ready for the verdict. When she stepped out, Silas was standing by the hearth, a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He was watching her. His face was unreadable, as it had been the day before. The children were nowhere to be seen. He gestured with his head toward the table. "There's coffee." She poured a cup, her hand shaking slightly. She did not dare look at him. She waited. He walked past her and went to the cabin door, opening it to the sharp, cold morning. He stood on the threshold for a moment, then turned back to her. He still held the letter in his other hand. "Come here," he said. It was not a request. She obeyed, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She followed him outside. The air was like ice against her cheeks. He walked to the smoldering fire pit from the night before, where a few embers still glowed red in the gray ash. He held out the letter. He did not look at her, but at the paper. "This," he said, his voice quiet but clear in the vast silence of the morning, "is a lie." And then, before she could process the words, he dropped the letter into the heart of the embers. She watched, speechless, as the corner of the envelope blackened, curled, and then caught flame. A small, bright orange fire consumed the careful script, turning the words of her condemnation to black, floating ash. It burned quickly, a final, definitive act. Silas watched it until nothing remained but a dark patch in the embers. He did not say another word. He turned and walked toward the woodpile, picking up his axe as if the day were just any other. Alara stood frozen, the smoke stinging her eyes. He had not cast her out. He had not questioned her. He had read the very worst of her, the poison her own family believed, and he had burned it. He had, in one simple, silent gesture, given her something she had not had in years. A beginning. The children were his next test. They were as wild and wary as young wolves. Leo left burrs in her bedding and hid the kindling. Willa refused to speak a single word to her, communicating only with her father through sharp glances and gestures. She would watch Alara with Sarah's eyes, a constant, silent accusation. Alara did not rise to the bait. She did not scold or punish. When she found the burrs, she picked them out without comment. When the kindling was gone, she went and gathered more. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She moved through the cabin with a quiet purpose that slowly, imperceptibly, began to change its atmosphere. She brought in pine boughs to freshen the air and found a patch of late-blooming mountain daisies to put in a jar on the table. Silas watched it all. He said little, but he noticed everything. He saw the way she never flinched from the children's hostility, meeting it with a deep, unshakable calm. He noticed the worn-out soles of her shoes and left a new pair, made of sturdy leather, by her cot one morning. He saw how she shivered in her thin shawl and draped a warm, heavy wolf pelt over the back of her chair. These were not gifts, they were transactions. She provided a service, he provided for her needs. That was the arrangement. Yet, he found himself watching her more and more. He watched her hands, surprisingly deft as she stitched a tear in Leo's shirt. He listened to the soft, humming sound she sometimes made while kneading dough. A sound that was not quite a song, but close. It was a sound of peace, and it was a sound his house had not known for a very long time. One afternoon a cry echoed from the woods behind the cabin. It was Leo. Silas was halfway across the clearing, axe in hand, when he saw Alara run out of the cabin, her skirts hitched up, moving faster than he'd ever seen her move. She reached the edge of the trees before him. He followed, his heart pounding with a cold dread. He found them in a small hollow. Leo was caught in one of his own rabbit snares, his ankle twisted at a terrible angle, the rope pulled taut. He was pale with pain and fear. "Don't touch it." The boy sobbed as Silas approached. "You'll make it worse." But Alara was already kneeling beside him. "Hush now," she said, her voice incredibly soft. "I see it. You made a good, strong knot. A fine trap. Now let's see about unmaking it." She did not yank or pull. Her fingers worked at the knot with a surgeon's precision, talking to Leo the whole time in a low, soothing murmur. She spoke of a fox she had once seen, and how clever it was. She spoke of the strength of the rope he had used. She did not mention his foolishness, or the fact that the trap was likely meant for her. Silas stood back, watching. He saw that her calm was a shield, protecting the boy from his own panic. The knot loosened. The rope fell away. Leo's small body sagged with relief, and for the first time he looked at Ilara with something other than hatred. It was a look of grudging wonder. Ilara tore a strip from her petticoat and began to bind his swelling ankle with practiced care. "It's a sprain," she said, looking up at Silas. "He'll need to stay off it." Silas nodded, his throat tight. He lifted his son into his arms. As he carried Leo back to the cabin, he saw Willa standing on the porch, her small face stricken. She had seen the whole thing. That evening, as Ilara was adding wood to the fire, Willa approached her. She held out a small, clumsily carved wooden bird. She did not speak. She simply placed it in Ilara's hand and fled to her bed. Ilara looked at the small, rough object. It was the first offering, the first crack in the wall of their grief. She closed her hand around it, feeling the sharp edges press into her palm. From his chair, Silas watched her face soften in the firelight. He felt something shift inside him, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even realized was there. This woman, this supposed curse, was bringing his children back to him. She was healing his house. And he realized, with a jolt that was almost fear, that he was beginning to feel something more than respect for her. He was beginning to feel a profound and dangerous gratitude. The first snow came early that year, a fine powder that dusted the peaks of the mountains and sharpened the air. With it came a change. The children's hostility had melted into a cautious acceptance. Leo would bring her interesting rocks he found by the creek. Willa started speaking to her, her voice small at first, asking questions about sewing or cooking. Ilara found herself settling into the rhythm of their lives. She learned the sound of Silas's footfalls, the way he liked his coffee, the stories behind the scars on his hands. He spoke little of his late wife, but her presence was a quiet ache in the house. Ilara respected it. She never tried to replace Sarah's memory, only to create a new space alongside it. One evening, while mending one of Willa's dolls, she found herself humming the melody Sarah used to sing. She had heard it from Willa, who would hum it softly to herself when she thought no one was listening. Ilara, without thinking, began to sing the words she had pieced together from the child's murmurs. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, went still. His hands stopped moving. He looked at her, his expression raw and unguarded for the first time. It was a look of such deep, aching sorrow that Ilara's voice faltered. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." He shook his head, clearing his throat. "No," he said, his voice thick. "It's all right." It was good to hear it again. He did not speak more of it, but the moment hung in the air between them. A shared piece of his past, a vulnerability he had allowed her to see. It was another wall crumbling, and they both felt it. Trust was being built, not with grand gestures, but with small, quiet moments of shared humanity. The real winter arrived with the fury of a starving wolf. A blizzard descended from the north, burying the cabin in a world of white. The wind howled, a ceaseless, malevolent shriek that rattled the shutters and drove snow through the tiniest cracks in the logs. For days they were prisoners in the small, warm space. And then Willa fell sick. It started with a cough, but quickly deepened into a fever that left her small body limp and burning. Her breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. Silas was gripped by a cold, familiar terror. It was the same fever, the same rattling breath that had stolen Sarah from him. He paced the cabin like a caged animal, his helplessness a palpable force in the room. "We need a doctor," he said, again and again, staring out at the white fury of the storm. "We cannot get to one," Alara said calmly, "and one cannot get to us. We will have to fight it here." And she fought. She used every bit of knowledge she had, gleaned from a life of hardship. She brewed teas from the herbs she had gathered in the fall, yarrow for the fever, mullein for the lungs. She kept cool compresses on Willa's forehead. She forced warm broth, spoonful by spoonful, between the child's cracked lips. For 3 days and 3 nights, she did not sleep. She sat by Willa's bed, a constant, vigilant presence. She held the child's hand, murmuring stories, humming songs, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm of the fever. Leo, frightened, stayed close to her. As if her calm could protect them all, Silas could only watch. He saw the deep purple shadows under Ilara's eyes, the exhaustion that pulled at her features. But he also saw a strength he had never witnessed in anyone. It was not the brute strength of an axe splitting wood, but the unyielding strength of a river wearing down stone. She was tireless, relentless. She was standing between his daughter and the grave, and she would not be moved. His practical arrangement, the bargain he had made, seemed a foolish, flimsy thing in the face of this. This was not the work of a hired woman. This was the fierce, protective love of a mother. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered into the cabin. And with the sun, the fever broke too. Willa woke, her eyes clear for the first time in days. She looked past her father, past her brother. Her gaze found Ilara, who was slumped in a chair by the bed, finally asleep. "Ilara," Willa whispered, her voice raspy. Silas felt the tears he had been holding back burn his eyes. He knelt by his daughter's bed, his hand trembling as he touched her cool forehead. She was alive. She was going to be well. And it was because of the woman in the chair. The curse, the bad omen. Later that day, he found Ilara outside, staring at the transformed world. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sparkling under the clear sky. The silence was absolute. He came and stood beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. "I thought I was going to lose her," he said finally, his voice rough with unshed tears, "just like I lost her mother." "But you didn't," Ilara said softly, not looking at him. He turned to face her. He saw the toll the last few days had taken. She looked fragile, worn down to her very essence. He felt an overwhelming urge to protect her, to shield her from any more hardship, any more pain. His respect had become admiration. His admiration had deepened into something warmer, something that felt dangerously like affection. "You saved her," he said, the words inadequate. "Ilara, you saved her." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, but they curled around his. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of connection, a silent acknowledgement that something profound had changed between them. The arrangement was broken, replaced by a bond forged in fear and sealed in relief. "I didn't expect this," he admitted, his gaze holding hers. "Any of this." "Neither did I," she whispered, and for the first time she gave him a small, weary smile. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds, and it struck him right in the heart. In that moment, standing in the silent, snow-covered world, Silas Blackwood knew he was lost. The stoic, guarded man who had made a bargain for a housekeeper was gone. In his place was a man who was falling in love with the quiet, resilient woman who had brought his family and his heart back to life. The spring came, and with it a trip to the settlement of Clearwater for supplies. It was the first time Ilara had been back to any kind of town since her arrival. The thought of it filled her with a quiet dread, a fear of the whispers and stares she had known her whole life. "You don't have to go," Silas told her, seeing the apprehension in her eyes. "I can manage." But the children were excited, chattering about seeing other people and the prospect of candy from the general store. She would not take that from them. "No," she said, forcing a smile. "I will go." Clearwater was a muddy, bustling street lined with false-fronted buildings. The moment they rode in, Elara felt the eyes on her. A new woman with the reclusive mountain man and his children. Speculation was a currency in towns like this, and she was a fresh mint. She kept her head down, focusing on keeping Willa from slipping in the mud. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of leather, coffee, and gossip. As Silas negotiated with the storekeeper for flour and salt, Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lingering snow on the north-facing roofs. A voice, oily and familiar, cut through the low hum of the store. "Well, I'll be." "Elara Miller. I heard they shipped you off like unwanted freight." She turned slowly. It was her uncle, Thomas Miller. He was slicker than she remembered, his waistcoat tight over a growing belly. He was there on business, his face a mixture of surprise and sneering contempt. His gaze swept over her, taking in her healthier appearance, the sturdy coat Silas had given her, and the two children who stood close by her side. "So this is where you landed," he said, loud enough for the entire store to hear. "With a wild man in the mountains. I suppose that's fitting." Elara felt the blood drain from her face. She saw the other customers turn to look, their faces curious. Silas stepped away from the counter, moving to stand beside her. He did not speak. He simply placed a hand on the small of her back, a small, steadying pressure. His presence was a silent warning. But Thomas Miller was emboldened by his audience. "This is the man you've fooled, is it?" he jeered, addressing Silas directly. "Did she tell you about her luck? Does she tell you she's a curse upon anyone foolish enough to get close? I sent a letter with her. A warning. I trust you had the good sense to read it." A murmur went through the store. Cursed, the word hung in the air, ugly and potent. Elara wanted to shrink, to disappear. This was her nightmare realized. The past she thought she had escaped had followed her down the mountain. But then she felt Leo's small hand slip into hers, his grip fierce. She saw Willa move to stand in front of her, a tiny, defiant shield. Before Elara could find her voice, before she could wither under the weight of the accusation, Silas spoke. His voice was not loud, but it had the carrying power of a winter wind. It cut through the murmuring and silenced the store. "I read the letter," he said, his eyes locked on Thomas Miller. A triumphant smirk crossed her uncle's face. "Then you know. You were warned. This woman brings nothing but ruin." "I read it," Silas repeated, taking a slow step forward. He was a foot taller than Miller, an imposing figure of quiet, coiled strength. "I read a coward's words, the words of a man who blamed a grieving girl for his own misfortunes, the words of a family that threw away something precious because they were too weak to hold on to it." The smirk vanished from Miller's face. "You speak of a curse," Silas continued, his voice resonating with a passion Elara had never heard. "Let me tell you what this woman brought to my home. She came to a house of silence and grief. My children were wild with sorrow. My heart was closed. And she, with nothing but her own quiet strength, healed us." He looked around at the silent, watching faces of the townspeople. "This woman, your curse, sat for 3 days and nights without sleep to fight the fever that tried to take my daughter. She taught my son how to be gentle again. She brought order and warmth and life back to a place that had none. She turned my house back into a home. He turned his gaze back to Miller, and it was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. The letter you sent? I burned it. I burned it the morning after I read it, because I would not have such a vile lie in my home. If her steadfastness is a curse, if her courage is a curse, if her kindness is a curse, then I will thank God for it every day of my life. He paused, letting his words sink in. Then he reached down and took Ilara's hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of everyone. She is not a curse, he declared, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. She is my wife in all but name. She is the mother of my children, and any man who speaks a word against her will answer to me. Silence, a deep, profound silence filled the store. Thomas Miller stood, his face mottled with rage and humiliation, utterly defeated. He had no words. The townspeople looked from him to the formidable mountain man and the quiet woman at his side. They looked at the two children standing guard, and in their eyes Ilara saw not pity or scorn, but a dawning respect. Silas held her hand tightly. He had not just defended her. He had claimed her. He had taken the ugliest word ever thrown at her and turned it into a badge of honor. He had given her his name, his protection, his heart, all in one breathtaking declaration. In the silence of the mercantile, surrounded by strangers, Ilara finally felt the last of her old life fall away, turning to ash, just as that letter had, leaving only the solid, warm reality of the man standing beside her. She was home. The ride back up the mountain was quiet. The children, sensing the gravity of what had happened, rode ahead, leaving Silas and Ilara to themselves. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, the sounds of the wilderness reasserting itself after the noise of the town. Ilara kept replaying his words in her head. She is my wife. He had said it so simply, with such unshakable certainty. It was a truth he had declared before he had even asked her. As they reached a high meadow overlooking the valley, Silas reined in his horse. He dismounted and came to her, holding up his hands to help her down. She slid from the saddle into his arms, and for a moment he did not let her go. He just held her, his face buried in her hair, breathing her in. "What I said back there," he began, his voice rough against her ear. "I meant every word." "I know," she whispered. He drew back, his hands framing her face. His slate-gray eyes were full of an emotion so intense it made her breath catch. "It's more than that, Ilara. When I saw that man look at you, when I heard him say those things, I realized that the thought of my life without you in it is no life at all." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved object. It was a ring, whittled from the pale, strong wood of a mountain ash tree. A thin band of silver, from one of his wife's old spoons he had melted down, was inlaid in the center. It was simple, imperfect, and the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "This is not an arrangement," he said, his voice thick with feeling. "This is not for the children, or for the house. This is for me. Because I love you. Ilara, will you be my wife? For real this time." Tears she had not known she was holding welled in her eyes and traced paths down her dusty cheeks. She had spent a lifetime being told she was worthless, a burden. And here was this good, strong man offering her everything, seeing in her everything she had never been allowed to see in herself. She could not find the words, so she simply nodded, a sob catching in her throat. He slid the wooden ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He lowered his head and kissed her. a kiss that was not gentle or tentative, but full of all the conviction and passion he had shown in the store. It was a kiss of promise, of belonging. It was the seal on a new life. A year later, Alara stood on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and purple. The air was warm, carrying the scent of the flourishing garden she had planted near the house. Silas was chopping wood for the evening fire, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comforting, familiar sound. Leo and Willa were playing by the creek, their laughter echoing in the quiet valley. They called her Mama now, the word as natural to them as breathing. Willa had her mother's eyes, but she had Ilara's smile. Leo had his father's quiet strength, but he had learned a gentleness from her. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the kick of the new life within her. A child of the mountain, a child of a love that had grown in the unlikeliest of soil. They would name her Hope. Silas finished his work and came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the last of the light fade. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked softly. "The letter?" He was quiet for a moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I think about the man who wrote it, and I feel pity for him." "Pity?" "He threw away his greatest treasure," Silas said, his voice a low rumble against her back. "And he was too blind to even know it." He turned her in his arms, his gaze soft in the twilight. "His curse was my blessing." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss of profound contentment. The children's laughter drifted up from the creek. The first star of the evening appeared in the darkening sky. The house behind them was warm and filled with light. It was a home, forged by hardship, built on truth, and filled with a love that needed no words.